Okay, Augustine writes, the apostles asked Jesus what ought to be thought of the Jewish prophets who were believed to have proclaimed his coming beforehand. The master was angry that they still held such thoughts. He answered, thou hast rejected the living one who is before thee and spoken idly about the dead. Now, this is parallel to another logion which is found in the Gospel of Thomas. So, I normally wouldn't condense two sayings together, but this one has exactly the same punchline. So if you're reading something, you don't want to give the same punchline twice. That's detrimental. So I combined them over here in the readable section, as little as possible, but I combined them. It says, the apostles asked Jesus what ought to be thought of the Jewish prophets who were believed to have proclaimed his coming beforehand. And here in brackets, I put, his disciples said to him, 24 prophets spoke in Israel, and all of them spoke in you. So in a way, this is the same question. So Augustine's take on this was that, he was angered by their question, and Thomas actually fleshes out the actual question, which Augustine has more or less paraphrased here. But it basically is describing the same thing. The 24 prophets represented the canon of the Jewish people. So it was they were the Jewish prophets. So this corroborates the notion that the 24 refers to the canon, because he phrases it in his own time as the Jewish prophets. So that is the 24 were believed to have proclaimed his coming beforehand, corresponds to all of them spoke in you. So it's reasonably accurate. And then he expresses his opinion that the master was angry at their thoughts. Because again, what were the thoughts? The thoughts that there were only 24 prophets that spoke in Israel, first of all. And also his omission, because his answer to them was, you have omitted the one living in your presence and have spoken idly of the dead. So this entire section right here pretty much has to do with the living and the dead. What does it mean to be alive, and what does it mean to be dead? We know that in the beginning part of the Gospel of Thomas, the statement is made that, whoever comes to hear these words and discovers their meaning will not ever taste of death. So you reason from that what death is and what life is. He gives you the means to do that anyway. Whoever hears these words and discovers their meaning will not taste of death. So what will they taste of then? Well, what is the opposite of death, right? Death is the inability to hear these words on a spiritual level, right? Discovering their meaning would be their spiritual meaning, right? So if they're not able to discover their spiritual meaning, they still exist in death. So that means if you don't understand the words of this book, right, then you walk in what he calls death, right? And so death is a function of not knowing the mystery, whereas life is the function of actually knowing it. So when he stands before them as the living one and speaks only of the old, what we now call the Old Testament, the 24 prophets, that is rejecting life, because see, the life that comes from him comes from within. There's two ways of looking at Scripture. There's from the top down and the bottom up. Basically the outside in or the inside out. If you understand something on a literary basis, you're understanding from what the Scriptures are telling you. If somebody says you can or cannot read these Scriptures, that's from the top down. That comes from a place of authority. It is subject to somebody's arbitrary decisions. Perhaps their whims, perhaps their wishes, but it's not organic. That's giving you a proxy that stands between you and direct perception, because somebody else is controlling what you're reading. They're saying these are the 24 prophets you should be reading, and that's it. And that corresponds to just any canon in general. Anytime you take certain books and put them in a box and say, here you go, this is what you're able to read, and everything else is bogus, versus being able to read something like the Gospel of Thomas and understand it. Because you see, if you're reading these books like the Gospel of Thomas and actually understanding them from the inside out and understand what he means by the living one, the one who is living in your presence, right? To understand that even now, thousands of years later, you're able to come alive by understanding the words that he is speaking means that these words are having their intended effect. And what is that intended effect? It is to bring his people to life, to bring the whole world to life, is what he says. So to speak only of the 24 is limiting their ability to come alive. Okay, and so then he gives them a stern warning. Again, this is also Gospel of Thomas. Take heed of the living one, right? The one living in your presence, the living one while you are alive. What does that mean? Alive as opposed to dead, right? Dead means that you don't understand. Alive means that you do. Dead means that you don't see patterns. Alive means that you do. Dead tells you that the Gospel of Thomas is bogus, but if you are alive, then you can understand it, right? And it has brought you, in a sense, to life, right? Then you recognize that the concept of the 24 prophets is there to blind you and basically to keep you spiritually dead. That the whole design of the canon is to kill you spiritually. Which is why he says, okay, the angels and the prophets will come to you and give you those things you already have, right? Well, think about it. We already have the Gospel of Thomas, but we need angels and prophets to explain it to us, in a sense, to give it to us, right? So in their day and age, right, remember Jude was reading the book of Enoch. Paul was reading several other books, the life of Adam and Eve. There are clear references to these things, basically as authoritative throughout the New Testament. Yeshua quotes the book of Enoch. He alludes to it several times, a great number of times, right? So in other words, what they had already, in other words, they had the book of Enoch, they had, these other books at their disposal. But it took angels and prophets, in a sense, to give them to them, right? In other words, to give them the meaning, right? And so he's saying now you, in turn, those of you who came to understand that we were talking outside of the canon and you left those things in your writings, like Jude did. Jude left traces of that in his writings. By calling him the seventh from Adam, he gave him his antiquity. By saying that he prophesied, he acknowledged that that Enoch was a prophet. Right? So he's doing that. He's giving those things to whom? To us, to those of us in the future. It says, the angels and the prophets will come and give you those things that you already have. In other words, the knowledge of the scriptures, because it's angelic and prophetic in nature, and the things that you already have. Well, what sort of spiritual resources did they have sort of at their disposal that freed them from the 24, right? You see, it just sort of logics in this direction. It says, and you too give them those things which you have. In other words, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the secret book of James, all of these different things that were preserved for us, and say to yourselves, like as if in kind. See how Enoch was delivered to you. See how all of these Old Testament prophets were delivered to you by means of their prophetic and angelic natures, right? So when will they in the future, they is us, by the way, that is us coming and taking what is ours, right? So taking this is, in a sense, taking what is ours. So we are them, right? They saw a Samaritan carrying his lamb on his way into Judea. He said to his disciples, why does that man carry the lamb? They said to him, so that he may kill it and eat it, right? He said, while it is alive, he will not eat it, but only when he has killed it and it has become a corpse. They said to him, he cannot do so otherwise. He said to them, you too look for yourself a place for yourself within the repose, lest you become a corpse and be eaten. So a corpse is a husk of a body. In the same way that if a scripture could supposedly be in a dead state, and a living state, right? Within the repose, again, the place of waiting, let's say. Again, if we sort of acknowledge that the Gospel of Thomas, for example, and other sources as well, but just say this, that we suppose that it was encoded to be decoded. That means that it was encoded with understanding. They had a spiritual understanding that they encoded. And then there is a place of repose, let's say, where it rests, where it lies in wait to be resurrected and understood again and decoded at the end of time. So there's sort of this latency period, right? So in other words, he's saying, listen, create a place for yourself within the repose. In other words, you have to write and to present yourself with clues, let's say, that will allow you to be, if you in a sense, resurrected. Because again, he doesn't want your words, your body of work, to become dead and to be consumed, spiritually consumed in a dead state, right? So, like when, for example, Jude leaves those clues, that particular information for us to pick up on at the end of time. For example, there is a time for that to not be known, and then for that to be rediscovered. And we're sort of on the rediscovery end. But a lot of these works did fall by the wayside. They weren't canonized, and therefore were not eaten. They were set aside to be preserved for a future generation, let's say. And he goes to a little further into the subject. This is from Hippolytus. It says, "If ye, eating that which was dead, have made it alive, what shall you do if you were to eat of what was alive?" Again, what is our food? Our food is the scripture. Our spiritual food that we eat, for example, Yeshua says, whatever goes into your mouth won't defile you. It's that which comes out of your mouth that will defile you. So in other words, it's not these scriptures that you consume, that you eat, that defile you, but it's your take on those, the things that you say about them, let's say. Now, eating what was dead, remember he spoke of the people who believed in the 24 prophets as being the dead. Let the dead bury their dead, right? In other words, those who believe in a canon, basically, right? And so when people don't understand, hey, how can you eat something without killing it? Well, again, because he's not talking about a sheep, he's not talking about a lamb, right? He's talking about the scriptures. If you ate what was, let's say, what the dead were reading, for example, if you were reading the 24 books, let's say, and you ate out of those books, let's say, and you have made it alive. Remember, he said that the prophets spoke in Israel, and they all spoke in you. So in a sense, they were making it alive, right? Because in other words, they were focusing on the 24, which is what the dead held to, right? But they also were proclaiming that they were prophesying about the coming of Yeshua. So they understood that mystery that was latent within the 24. So it wasn't like they didn't understand. They had made that alive. That had become alive to them. Remember, on the road to Emmaus, when Yeshua was holding his appearance from those men, they felt their hearts burn within them as a function, basically, of him explaining to them just exactly that the prophets that spoke in Israel all spoke in him. So he was proclaiming that to those people on the way to Emmaus. And so he was making them alive, or it alive to them. So once you see the 24 in that light, you realize that the word has come alive to you, and you have come alive because of it. And so what would maybe be the fallout of this? The next verse kind of gives us a hint. He says, "This heaven will pass away, and the one above it will pass away." So one thing about it is, does God's heaven pass away? Does this passing away of the heavens and the earth, let's say, because again, we know he says the heavens and the earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So what does he mean by heavens and the earth? Well, obviously he's not talking about the eternal heavens. He's talking about the temporal heavens. So how many of these do we have? We have this one and we have the one above it. So he's talking about two heavens that will pass away. And so this is a lowercase heaven, obviously, because it's not talking about the eternal heaven, but the temporal heaven that is linked with the earth. And that's because, like, when we understand something on the heavenly level, we understand that there's two levels to everything. There's a heavenly level and there's an earthly level. But there's essentially two false ones. That is to say, like elsewhere where he says, if they say to you, it is in the sky, then the birds will precede you there, right? Which heaven and sky are related words here. And if they say that it's in the sea or whatever, then the fish will be you there. But it's talking about heavens in a metaphorical sense, like with regards to the heavens that are taught. So what are the two that we are taught? And how is one over the other? Well, this one here he's talking about is the current one. So in other words, the teachings, if you will, of men, that which passes away, in other words, with regard to Yeshua and his times, right? This heaven will pass away because that teaching will be at some point upended, obliterated. And the one above it will pass away. Again, that's Judaism, because Christianity is loosely based on Judaism and largely patterned after it. And again, he reinforces that notion by referring to the dead. The dead are not alive, and the living will not die. So he's contrasting the two spirits. Those who do not have the truth, right, are the dead, right? So what does he mean? You have spoken only of the dead, right? That those who believed in the 24 prophets, in other words, right? So he's clearly talking about them in that particular context. So the dead are not alive, right? So you don't really have anything to learn from them. And again, their quote unquote heaven, their authority, in other words, the power that they wield over you, right, is temporal, right? And Judaism, again, is temporal, right? But the living will not die. In other words, once you know the truth, it's like people say once you see something, you can't unsee it. He's giving you eyes to see and ears to hear. This isn't some just wild belief that you'll someday say, oh, I feel silly for having believed that or whatever. It's something like, no, I recognize this now. It is bringing me to life. And so I have become one of the living, right? So again, what are you going to do? In the days when you consumed what is dead, in other words, in the days when you read the 24 prophets as if that were the limit, in the days in which you consumed what is dead, you made it alive, right? In other words, you saw the hidden meaning in it. You saw the life that was concealed in the death of the flesh. You saw the heavenly concealed in the fleshly level. When you come to dwell in the light, when you come to recognize the hidden meaning, what will you do? Right? Again, on the day when you were one, right? In the day when you recognized the unity of the truth, right? You became two. You became detached from that knowledge, and so were therefore split into the upper and the lower. And when you become two, what will you do? Again, because how do you then achieve the one? How do you return to the one? Right? You have to find the light. You have to come to dwell in the light. You have to do as they did, and eat that which is dead, and then make it alive, so that you can then eat what is alive, right? Because what is alive? He says he's the one. He's right. The one living in our presence,